Hello, and welcome to our entry-level bumblebee identification workshop. The first half of today's talk is going to be on ecology and surveying, so a bit of background information on bumblebees, how we survey them at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and how you can get involved with that. Nationwide, there are between about 270 to 280 different species of bee in Britain, so they're a lot more complex than most people give them credit for. One of those species is the honeybee, Apis mellifera, this little guy up here. You can see they're quite small, quite bald. They're essentially domesticated in Britain. There are very, very few wild colonies left. At the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, we work mainly on the 24 different species of bumblebee that remain in Britain. This is Bombus pascorum, the common carder bee, but it's pretty representative of the group as a whole. Great big chunky looking bees, lots of fur all over them. 18 of the bumblebees are what we call social species. They make nests and do normal bumblebee things. The other 6 are cuckoo bumblebees, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. The remaining 250 or so species of bee in Britain are solitary bees, and they're called solitary not because they live alone, never meet another bee, but because each female bee builds her own nest. And they come in various different shapes and sizes and colours and life history strategies, from the ivy bee, our last emerging bee of the year, to more cuckoo bees like this nomad here, and in the middle, Osmia bicolour, which is perhaps my favourite bee. But there's not enough time to actually speak about those in any great detail, so for the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on the bumblebees. And wherever you are in the world, bumblebees are all in genus Bombus, so it's quite a close-knit group. It's a similar sort of level of relationship as between dogs and wolves and coyotes. And worldwide, there are between 250 to 270 different species of bumblebee. So we've actually got 10% of the world's species of bumblebee, which is quite a lot for a small, cold, damp island in the North Atlantic. Most insects, you get huge diversity down in the tropics. Brazil has thousands of species of butterfly, for instance, and that number declines as you get further north until we're down to about 55 or so native breeding species of butterfly. Bumblebees don't really work like that. They really like the temperate areas, and so Europe is a real hotspot for bumblebees. They do really quite well here, and it means that Britain is unusually important in conservation of bumblebees compared to most other animal groups, most other wildlife groups in general. And that number isn't precise because we are losing species to extinction on far too regular a basis, but also because new species are arriving. And this is not being discovered in the sense of Victorian naturalists, where you hack your way through the rainforest and uncover a pristine valley that no one has ever seen before, with all sorts of new interesting things in it. Increasingly, this is because geneticists are getting more and more involved in taxonomy. And so you go to museums in Oxford or Paris or London and you root through the drawers of hundreds or thousands of specimens collected over the last 200 years, and you look at their genes, and increasingly what we find is that what we thought of as one species, which varied very slightly depending on whether you found it in the south of Europe or the north of Europe or whatever, is actually several different species which look very, very similar to each other, but which have distinct genes. And the poster child for this is our own white-tailed bumblebee, Bombus leucorum. We thought it was Bombus leucorum anyway. It turns out it's actually 3 different species. We do have Bombus leucorum, but we also have Bombus magnus and Bombus cryptarum. So identifying them got a lot more difficult fairly recently, unfortunately, and they're what we call cryptic species. All bumblebees, certainly in Britain and Ireland, have an annual life cycle. As I said before, most of them are social, a handful, 6 or so are parasitic. We'll go through those in a bit more detail, but they feed exclusively on pollen and nectar. So they really are dependent on there being enough flowers in the wider area. They can forage over a reasonable sort of size area, but still, you've got to have enough flowers there, and you've got to have enough flowers there from March, when the queen's coming out of hibernation, right the way through to the end of the flight season in September, October, to sustain the bumblebee colonies. They are really well adapted to efficient collection. You can see the hind leg here is flattened. It's almost hollowed out. It's like a teaspoon, basically. You've got these long fringing hairs you can see on the side here. They form this sort of basket type shape. and it will mix a little bit of nectar in with the pollen and stick it till it's about the consistency of plasticine or Play-Doh, and you get a great big blob of pollen in that hind leg bit here. It's what we call the pollen basket, funnily enough. What you can't see is that in the front of the bee's digestive system, in the front of the abdomen here, is a great big sac, basically, which is the honey stomach. It fills that with nectar. It can drink from that. It can take that nutrition if it needs to. But more generally, certainly with worker bees, it will fill that honey sac completely to the brim. And then when it comes back to the nest, it will regurgitate it up through its mouth parts again and fill any pots and that sort of thing, feed larvae. So they're really quite well adapted to efficient collection of both pollen and nectar. And they're quite well adapted to living in cold conditions, which is why they're predominantly found in the temperate regions, not the tropics. They actually evolved about 35 million years ago in the foothills of the Himalayas. As the Himalayas were pushed further north, as India pushed into the rest of the continental plate there, the plateau that became the Himalayas was pushed further and further up. And so you got the bees that were living on there, which included the proto-bumblebees, having to progressively adapt to colder and colder conditions until you got more or less what we've got here. Big chunky bees, so not too much surface area to lose that heat, lots of hair all over them so that they keep that heat in once they've got it, and great big flight muscles in here to generate not only the ability to fly but also an awful lot of heat. And as they dispersed out of the Himalayas, they couldn't go south, it was just too hot. Bumblebees can't really fly when the air temperature is above about 30 degrees Celsius, because otherwise they can't vent that heat quickly enough and they start to cook themselves from the inside out, which is never a great survival tactic. Instead, they went north and spread out through the temperate regions until you've got lots in North America, lots in, Europe, 10% of the world's species in Britain and Ireland, and you actually got a couple of species, Bombus polaris and Bombus hyperboreus, which live well within the Arctic Circle in a way that most other insects don't. And this is why. This is an infrared picture of a bee warming up on a relatively cool morning. You can see the darker the colours here, the colder it is. So the ground here is about 16, 17 degrees Celsius. The air is a bit warmer. But the bee itself, you can see, is much, much warmer than that background. It's up about 35 degrees Celsius in the middle of the thorax here. And this is the flight muscles. You can see this plume of hot air coming off it. And if we look at this X-ray, you can see almost the entire thorax is just full of these great big flight muscles in here. And flapping them 2,500 times a minute generates a huge amount of heat. And the bee has quite a complex system whereby it can pump hot blood into the abdomen if it wants to vent that heat, it wants to have a greater surface area, or shut it off if it doesn't want to vent heat, if it's warming up. You can see this bee, the thorax is much, much hotter than the abdomen. It's not pumping that hot blood out. So it can get these wing muscles up to a working temperature in a much quicker fashion than if it has to bask in the sunlight like many other insects that you'll see. And this is why they have quite a long season compared to a lot of other things. In the winter, you can just about make out the queen bumblebee tucked up here. This is a little hibernaculum, a little cell that she's dug out. In this case, she's in a pot plant. Compost is nice and easy to dig through, but you can find them underneath stones and in old rotten logs, under the moss at the base of trees, anywhere that will stay fairly cool and fairly dry all winter. They don't want to get wet, go mouldy, and they don't want to be flooded, obviously. But equally, they don't want somewhere that will be warm in January, on that one warm day we have over the winter, come out and then get a load of snow dumped on them the next day. It's not going to do them any good. They want it to stay nice and cold until spring is actually properly here. Once it is, you get queen bumblebees. They'll be coming out, and their first job, having not moved, not eaten for 6-8 months, is to find as much food as they possibly can. And so pussy willow trees like this are really, really good for those early spring bumblebees. They're flowering at the right time. Each of these catkins is a whole load of flowers stuck together. So really good nectar sources for those early spring queen bumblebees. But you'll see them on whatever is flowering at that time of year, daffodils and ground ivy and that kind of thing. Once the queens have slaked their thirst, they've got themselves back into working order, they need to find a nest. And they will build their nest the bottom of grass tussocks, in old mouse burrows, in bird boxes and that sort of thing. There's a bit of variation depending on the species. And this is a top-down view of a bumblebee nest. The first thing that most people notice is that it's not the very, very neat arrangement of hexagons that you expect to see in a bee nest, and that's because only honeybees really do that sort of overly neat comb type approach. Bumblebees have this much more laissez-faire attitude to nest building. They secrete the wax from between plates of the abdomen, build these little thimble-shaped pots, and fill them with pollen, fill them with nectar. These little white C-shaped things here are the bee grubs, bee larvae, the caterpillar stage essentially. These are a couple of eggs up here. The queen will lay eggs that turn into workers. All the workers are female. When those workers hatch out, their only job really is to go out and bring food back to the colony. So they'll go back, forth, out of the nest, flower, 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 back into the nest, dump off the pollen, dump off the nectar, and repeat that dawn to dusk. Eventually, once the nest has got enough nectar and pollen in it, then the queen will start to change what the nest is producing to produce males. This is a male bumblebee here. They're only produced in a burst at the end of the colony life cycle, really. And the queen bumblebees, these great big chunky ones here. Each queen takes about 3 times as much food during development as the worker of the equivalent species. Males take a bit more than a worker as well. So this is a considerable investment on behalf of the nest, but they'll go off and mate. The males, any remaining workers and the old queens will all die off gradually over the course of the autumn. The new queens, once she's mated, she'll go off and find her own hibernation site, and the whole cycle will begin again the following year. Unfortunately, over the last 150 years or so, that's not a system that's worked very well for most British bumblebee species. The first real bumblebee Bible was published in 1912 by a guy called Sladen. He was based down in Kent. We used to see all sorts of rare bumblebees, what we now think of as vanishingly rare bumblebee species. Around about the middle of the 20th century, people started to realise that what they were finding, going out looking for bumblebees, was not matching what Sladen had been writing about 30, 40, 50 years before. And so during the 1970s, surveying started for this atlas, published in 1980, and found really, really widespread declines for a whole range of bumblebee species compared to 1900. In particular, over a third of the social bumblebees, 7 of our 18 social bumblebee species, had declined by more than 70% in that 80-year period, which is extinction level population dynamics. We actually lost 2 species to extinction during the 20th century. Bombus cullimanus, Culliman's bumblebee, was last seen on the Berkshire Downs in 1941, and the short-haired bumblebee, Bombus subterraneus, last recorded in 1988, declared extinct in the year 2000. We've got 8 species that are listed as species of conservation concern, conservation priority nationwide. 8 out of 24, 25 species, includes a reintroduced population of Bombus subterraneus here, which unfortunately almost certainly doesn't exist anymore. But that's a third of our remaining bumblebee species. This is a really at-risk group because they're so dependent on flowers and having that really high quality landscape. Bumblebees are the canary in the coal mine for most of our other wildlife species. Where the bumblebees have been going for the last 100 years, a lot of other things are likely to follow unless we can get things right for bumblebees. And real poster child for this, unfortunately, is our great yellow bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus, this guy here. Fantastic thing, great big chunky bee, bright golden yellow all over, just this black band between the wing bases isn't this bright golden yellow. I've been up to Orkney to see them. It's like being pelted with tennis balls when you get these things going past you in a high wind. They're really fantastic little bumblebees. And if you go back 100 years, it's never massively abundant across most of England and Wales, but it's there. It clearly likes it in the far north, particularly in the Western Isles and the Orkneys here, but it's all over the country. And if you go to the museums in London or Oxford, you can see specimens taken from these counties, and right in the middle here, they are not a rare species at this point. If we look at the second half of the 20th century, however, Bearing in mind how much more bumblebee surveying there was going on in the second half of the 20th century. During this period, we've got 2 world wars, we've got the Great Depression, there is no formalised surveying for bumblebees or anything going on, and we've still got all of these records. If you look at the second half of the 20th century, without that level of distraction, with 20 years of surveying for biodiversity action plans and that sort of thing, with the surveying for that 1980 atlas as well, with all of that survey effort, there are 2 Welsh records and 9 English records in the whole of that 50-year period, almost all of them in the first 10 years of it. This is a species which is really retreating from southern Britain. And if we look at the 21st century, it's gone. It is extinct as an English species, it is extinct as a Welsh species. Even these former hotspots up in the far north of Scotland here, you can see they're a fraction of what they used to be. It's still doing very well in places. Bits of the Orkneys, you're almost guaranteed to see it. The western side of the US here is really good for it. But this is a species which is really on the edge in Britain. It would really like to be living up in the subarctic, up around this sort of level. That's its climatic preference. It could survive in Britain where the habitat was good enough to offset that imbalance. It now isn't good enough to offset that imbalance, and so the species has declined massively as it retreats northwards. And a lot of our other species are doing similar, or at least equivalent things, unfortunately. So, why? There is an awful lot of stuff out there about pesticides, neonicotinoids in particular, and that kind of thing. But the real big problem for bumblebees is habitat. By the time you've got a nest of 100 or even up to 400 or so sterile workers for every reproductive individual, they're only feeding on flowers. They need those flowers from, as I say, March right the way through to September, October sort of time. They need big areas, well-connected areas of flower-rich grassland, and we just don't have that in Britain across most of the country nowadays. This figure, I'm sure most of you have seen, 98% of flower-rich grassland has been lost in the UK since the 1930s to the 1940s. That's actually a quote from a paper published in 1984, just looking at that 50-year period, 1934 to 1984. We've lost at least half of the remaining flower-rich grassland since that point, so this is probably more like 99.5% of that flower-rich lowland grassland in that time period. This is a massive, massive decline, and that's mirrored by loss of hedgerows, which are really good for early season bumblebees, loss of heathland. All these wild flower-rich habitats just aren't there. And partly this is agricultural changes to more intensive methods, so changing from hay meadows to silage cuts, the removal of hedgerows and tidying up of those scrubby little corners and that sort of thing. It's very easy to blame farmers for this, and that's certainly a position that you'll see across a lot of articles. But farmers have to survive as well. They're running businesses, and that is what they got paid for. And supermarkets and that kind of thing squeeze the farmers massively in terms of the actual farm gate price, what they then sell on to you at a much greater price. And farmers have done what they need to do to survive. It's not ideal, but there are a lot of farmers who are trying to reverse that process. We work with an awful lot of them within the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and there are an awful lot that we haven't yet worked with out there as well. This is not farmers setting out to destroy the environment. This is farmers trying to survive, and unfortunately, what's got squeezed is the wildlife in the middle. And unfortunately, we can say pretty much the same thing about all kinds of wildlife declining. So birds, farmland birds, seabirds, wetland birds, ladybirds, ground beetles, butterflies, moths, all sorts of things are declining, and unfortunately it's very difficult to make some people care. And unfortunately that includes a lot of people in Downing Street. But the great advantage that bumblebees have is that they do have an economic value as well. So it's not just that wildlife that we like to see is declining, it's that wildlife that gives us money, essentially, is declining, and that's far more of a topic if you're trying to talk to politicians. So a fairly recent paper found that insect pollination in the UK was worth about 600 million a year. That number fluctuates every year depending on how much of each crop is grown and what the price is. but at least 500 million every year contributed for free by insect pollinators. This is not just bumblebees, but flies, wasps, all sorts of other things as well. Anything that visits flowers and transfers pollen. Various other papers have found that within the EU as a whole, insect pollinators were contributing 14.2 billion and up to about 265 billion euros worldwide. This is not an insignificant amount of money. Another paper published quite a while ago now found that if we were to try and replace by hand pollination the work which is currently done for us for free by insect pollinators, at a really conservative estimate, they reckon that that would cost £1.8 billion every year. Now, you don't need to be a major league economist to see that spending 1.8 billion on a service worth currently 600 million doesn't really add up. So either people won't do it, and you won't be able to get healthy food, apples, fruit and veg, that sort of thing, or you'll be able to get it, but it will have to cost 2, 3, 4 times as much for it to be worth anyone's while to actually grow the stuff. And so you see all kinds of crazy ideas like drones and that kind of thing, which are frankly stupid. And even then, that might possibly work if you put enough effort into it for agricultural crops, but no one is going to do that for the flowering plants in the wider countryside. There are, at a rough estimate, about 9,000 species of flowering plant in the wild, in the countryside, in people's gardens. 90% of those wildflowers, of those flowering plants, depend on insects for pollination. No one is going to invent a robot to come and pollinate the flowers in your window box, in the bottom of your garden, at the bottom of the hedge down the street. It's just not going to happen. So bumblebees and their other insect pollinator friends help to support these massive great networks of semi-natural flower-rich grassland, places like Salisbury Plain or your local park. If we don't have bumblebees, if we don't have insect pollinators, we won't have that countryside. In the same way, we'll have sweeping changes, we'll have a lot of grasses, we'll have a lot of conifers, we won't have anywhere near the same number of flowering plants. And people talk about honeybees as a potential solution to this problem. If we all go and keep honeybees, then we'll solve this pollinator crisis. But every honeybee has a fairly short tongue, 6.5 millimeters long, because they're all the same species. If you want to visit a flower, it's got to be worth your while as a bee. So anything with a corolla, a flower tube, which has got more than 6.5 millimeters between where the bee can get its face into and where the nectar is, honeybees aren't going to bother visiting that. So that's fine if you want to grow daisies and that kind of big flat flowers. If you want to grow foxgloves or snapdragons, that sort of thing, broad beans as we've got here, that's not so good because the honeybees either won't bother to visit, or they'll visit them, but they'll bite their way in round the back and take the nectar without actually doing any pollination. So honeybees can visit and will pollinate some plants, certainly, and they include a lot of important flowers and important crops and that kind of thing. But if you want this whole range, all these other flowers in this green area, all the things like the broad bean, like your daffodils, then honeybees just aren't enough. You need a wide, diverse assemblage of pollinators if you want a wide, broad assemblage of plants as well. And honeybees, actually on a per bee basis, aren't particularly good pollinators. You can see she's collected the pollen from the flower here. It's all carefully packaged onto the hind leg. It's not actually available for pollination. You compare that to this bumblebee, who, as soon as it lands on the next flower, half of that pollen is going to fall straight off again and do the actual pollination. Pollination is moving that pollen from one flower to the next. Honeybee isn't doing that. Bumblebees are. They're not kings of this because actually a lot of solitary bees are much, much better than either bumblebees or honeybees because they carry the pollen loose in this brush on the back end here. And again, as soon as they land on the next flower, this pollen is then daubed off onto the relevant bits of the female flower, and it does a lot more pollination. But bumblebees are in that sweet spot of doing a lot of pollination, having a lot of individuals. They do an awful lot of good stuff for us, basically. So, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, obviously we're concerned about bumblebees and we want to conserve them a little bit more. But the first step is to know what we've got and where is it. Many of the common species are just listed as everywhere, which is great, which is too common to mention, but that's not an awful lot of good if we want to know whether they have declined or not, because you can't really put everywhere into your stats program. We do have reasonable distribution records, certainly for the last 40 or 50 years in particular. So we do know where they have been, particularly the rare species. But what we don't know very much about is abundance. There are all sorts of clever statistical ways to try and infer abundance from distribution records, but it's easier just to go and count the things. And that gives us early warning of what species are doing well, what species are doing badly, whether that varies across the country, whether that varies between habitats, to get that early warning of decline, of bees going from loads and loads of them at a site, gradually declining until you're into tens rather than hundreds, then you're down to the last one. You can't get that from a distribution map. You have present or absent. If you have an idea of abundance, you can get that early warning of when things are likely to go extinct. You can get an idea of what techniques for conservation are actually working if the numbers are starting to come back up. It's a really useful thing to be able to tell, basically. And so one of the first projects that the Trust actually set up when they were founded was BeeWalk. It first started in 2008 with the idea of gathering abundance data on these bumblebees. So the basic idea is that volunteers across the country, we currently have about 500 or so, they go out and they walk a transect, a fixed route, at least once a month between March and October. So across the full flight period of the bumblebees, we recommend that the walk is about 1 to 2 kilometres long, so about a mile, because in midsummer, when there's loads of bees about, that can take about an hour. And we ask the volunteers to count the bees that they see and identify them to species as far as possible. We have unknown bumblebee as a species. It's still useful, but we don't want people to be overly optimistic, basically, about their identifications. If they didn't know what it was other than a bumblebee, that's fine. That's still useful information for us. And this is the only national scheme for abundance of a major pollinator group. It's the only way that we have detecting these population level declines over time. And so the only way that we have of getting these early warning of bumblebee losses and of getting there in time to do something about it. So BeeWalk does have 3 main aims. First is to gather both abundance and distribution data for all of the UK's bumblebee species. Once we've got that, we want to analyse that data and report trends in bumblebee populations over time. So I'll say we can see which are up, which are down, and to pin down and investigate further the causes of these changing trends in bumblebees. So is climate change having an effect on bumblebees? Is it just habitat change? What's going on with them? Basically, are there differences in regions, in habitat types, all that sort of stuff? We just don't know at the moment. So once you go out and you try and set up a transect, we recommend that you do make an extra site visit just to map out your route rather than trying to do it at the same time as counting bumblebees. But establish a transect, so your fixed route, in your preferred location. We aren't at a position where we can tell you which bits you need to walk generally, but it does have to be somewhere which is convenient and accessible to you. Otherwise it's very easy for life to get in the way and you aren't actually able to go and do it. We suggest that it's, as I say, about a mile long, because that will take about an hour in midsummer, and it should be split into sections based on the habitat that you walk through. So in this sort of area, this would be one section along the top of the hills here. As soon as you drop into the woods on either side, that would be a different section because it's a different habitat, and there are different things going to be affecting the bees in those areas. So you don't find bees as much in woodland, for instance. So I'm just going to take you now through the process of setting up a transect walk. So go to My Sites, first of all, let that load. So I've got a couple of existing sites here already, but then add site, it'll take you to this. So give your transect a name, ideally one which you can find on a map. There's a very low limit for how many transects called My Garden you can actually have in any meaningful way. So we will call this South Coombe Farm. So you can use this map here to zoom in. So Mid Devon. Use this little cross here to switch between Street View and Google Satellite View, so you can see the aerial photo coming in here. So we will say that we will plonk it here. So you click somewhere what's going to be in the middle of your transect. It will automatically fill out the grid reference here, so you don't need to worry about fiddling about with that. Put in what county you're in. In this case, we're in Devon. So there we go. Number of sections. In this case, I will say that we're going to have 2 sections. Don't worry about length yet, that will fill in automatically. And put in the year that we established. And then click Save. That will take you to this next page, centered on your grid reference. Again, you can switch between the Street View and Google Satellite here. So I'm going to do a bit of a walk around the edges of this meadow. So we're in section 1, you can tell that because it's the mucky greeny browny colour. This is the draw transect. As you can see, you get the tooltip when you go over it. We'll come down the road here and we'll start here. So click on the map where you start your walk. And as you can see, you've got this red line which follows your cursor and sticks to the map wherever you click. So we're going to follow the tractor tracks along here. You can see you can use it to go around corners and that kind of thing. And then double click at the end of that section and it's done. So it stopped following your cursor. If you want to adjust it slightly, then you click on this modify one and you can see that you can drag those. So if I was a bit far out in the field there, I can move it around, or if I do that. But broadly speaking, that looks about right. So we'll go back to clicking. We'll click on section 2 here. Again, you can see that this has gone the mucky brown colour because it's now active. Section 1 has gone blue. So you can zoom in using either the bit here or just zooming in and out with your mouse. And then again, click around here, go under that tree, around the edge here. You can click and drag if you want to move the window around, and that won't have stuck it to the map as long as you click and hold. And then keep clicking all the way around the field here, along in the shadow of the hedgerow here. This is all the same habitat, obviously it's hedgerow on one side and field on the other, which is why this can be a slightly longer section as we come along the edge of the field here till we get to here, and double click end here at the gateway. If I think, actually, I'm going to do this last section, I've got to walk back along the track here, so I'm going to insert a section. Yes, I want to insert a section after S2. I'll have a bit of a think. Reload. So you do unfortunately need to change the map view again. But then click on section 3 on the draw, zoom in. That's maximum zoom. And then again, click all of our way along here. So we'll walk around this bend in the road, back to where we started here. Double click like that. So you can see it didn't work the first time, but I could tell that because it didn't go yellow and it was still following the cursor. Now we've got a slightly funny wobble here, so we are going to go and adjust that. There we go. Move that out there, move that up to there. Twiddle around with it a little bit until you're happy with it, and then we're done. So scroll up and we go to section details, the next bit. So it's automatically filled in the section grid references here. Click on section 1, easier from the start. And then we just need to put a bit of information about primary and secondary land uses in there. So primary land use is agriculture, farmer's field, principal habitat present. In this case we had a field on one side, which if we scroll down you can see we've got various grasslands here. And it had a little bit of woodland on the other side. We're going to be mostly in the field, so we're going to say that the main one is this grassland. We automatically filled in here the section length, so we don't need to worry about that, which is good. Secondary land use. Let's have a bit of a look through these options. These are all standardised so that we can basically compare like with like. And the secondary habitat is that bit of woodland, so we're going to go with unmanaged forest. Second habitat present is also that woodland because we put grassland as the main one. So if we scroll down, we have somewhere got mature broadleaf woodland, just checking if there's more appropriate, and no, that's fine. Then third and fourth, these are basically in order of importance, in order of area, so the majority of the bit that you walked through there was grassland, bit of woodland within your recording box. Where's woodland gone? And along the edge of that we had tall herbs, there's a lot of nettle, there's willow herbs and that sort of thing, and there wasn't really a fourth habitat, so we'll leave that. And it's broadly covered, we don't need to put anything in those boxes particularly. But we do need to repeat that process for the second section. We do want to save them as we go on. Thank you. So second section, primary land use, still agriculture. Principal habitat is still grassland. You can see it's a much longer section, which it knows. So there isn't really a secondary land use here. Secondary habitat present is hedgerows. So if we scroll down, we can find hedgerows in here somewhere. There we are, 25 hedgerows. And again, there's a little bit of our tall herb, nettles, that sort of thing in there. If I can find it, there we are, 21. Go to 3. Yes, we want to save the changes. Thank you, changes have been saved. So primary land use, again, agriculture. Principal habitat, again, is still grassland in this bit. Secondary land use is a track, really. Transport tracks and ways, there we go. Secondary habitat present doesn't really have one. Maybe there's a little bit of bare ground. But that doesn't really fit, so we will, oh there we are, bare ground, weeds or aquifield margins, that will fit it. And now we click save, and that's done. Then when it comes to actually recording your data, once you've done a walk, we go to My Walks. That will load this calendar. You can see here, you can see I've done various walks and recorded them so far. We're going to record the walk that I did yesterday, the 18th of August. So click on that little plus. Select your transect. There's quite a lot to scroll through, but if you click on the letter that starts your transect, it gets you to a bit of a head start there. So we'll scroll through until we see Lower Witch Road. There we go, wrong one. So as you can see, you double check. Lower Witch Road, Malvern. Let's put date in automatically. It's got my name in there. We started it at 09:07, looking at my notebook, and we finished it. It's quite a short transect, so it only took 12 minutes. So that is 09, 19. Sunshine, sunny, cloudy. Wind speed was fairly low, about 3, and the temperature was about 19 degrees Celsius. So input all of those. You can see you can get away without those end bits, but they are really useful to us. You can't get away without these essentials, which are marked with a red asterisk. Go to next step, and so in section 1 I didn't actually see anything, or in section 2, section 3 we did see a bee. We saw Bombus lapidarius. So as I start typing, it will start thinking and trying to match. You can see it's got various species there. Bombus lapidarius, there we are, the red-tailed bumblebee. I saw 2 males, and they were both on creeping thistle. There we go, we can select that from the list, or possibly with a space in. There we go. I also saw a buff-tailed bumblebee, so you can see you can put it in English as well. Select from the list. That was a worker and also a male there, and again creeping thistle patch. I put a comment in, that one very faded. Then on, make sure we put in the section, so section 3 for that one. On the next section, section 4, I saw one very bedraggled buff tail. So straightforward, you can also select it with an enter. That was a male. I'll just put that it was bedraggled. You don't need to do that. And then section 5, I saw a queen hypnorum, so tree bumblebee. Again, I can put in the Latin. If I get it wrong, I can go back and I can change Bombus hypnorum. If I put that in and realise that it's wrong, I can either delete it by clicking on that, gone, or I can edit it by clicking on this little notepad and pencil thing, and then you can see you've got that there. So it just lets you put it in again. So section 5 was right down the end. It was queen, nice fat queen, and she was on footweed. Go to the next step. This is any notes about the wider route as a whole. So you don't need to do this, but it's always useful to have a bit of context. And if there's something which has changed everything, if it was started to rain at the end of section 2 or whatever, then you can put it in here. Then we go save, and that's done. There we go. I'll take you back to this data entry screen in case you want to put any more in. But now, if we go up to my walks here, you can see here it is, 18th of August, Darwich Road. And if you need to, you can go back in, click on it, and it will let you go through and edit the various bits. If you had an unidentified bumblebee, you now know what it was, for instance, you can go back and you can change it, you can edit it. In this case, it's the same species. Go through and save, and it's done. So once you've set up your transect and you're at the level of wanting to actually walk it, there are a few key things. Firstly is walk the same transect every time. That's the whole point of it. It's a fixed survey, so that makes it comparable. Basically between months, years, people, whatever, if we know where you've gone, what you've looked for, we know that it is actually comparable data. It's useful data at the end of it. To make sure that we get the full flight period of the bumblebees, it's really quite important you do walk that transect at least once a month. If you want to walk it more frequently, that's fine. We're always at home to more data, but do make sure that you don't miss too many months. It's very easy to start missing an awful lot of data that way. The other thing is that make sure you're only going out and surveying when the weather conditions are vaguely suitable for bumblebee activity. Those of you who've come across the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme will be familiar with the sort of paragraph of text they've got about how sunny it can be, what temperature it can be before you survey for butterflies. That's essentially because they are a lot less hardy than most bumblebees. Bumblebees, generally the best technique is just to look out of the window, and if you wouldn't mind going out, it looks reasonably okay, the bumblebees will be out there. So our equivalent of that paragraph is just make sure that it's fairly warm, it's not too windy, and it's not actually raining or hailing at that point. Generally between about 11 and 5 p.m. is recommended, but obviously that's not set in stone. The bees will be out there from dawn until dusk. At the start of each survey, do fill out the environmental details, so it is things like temperature, just to make sure that we've got that, and we can take that into account then when it comes to actually analyse that data that you send in. Once you're actually out on a transect, walk at a roughly slow and steady sort of pace. It's very, very tempting always just to power walk across the bit where you never see any bees, and to linger and walk really slowly past this big patch of flowers that's always got loads and loads of bees in. If you need to identify a bee, need to catch it and have a closer look or whatever, you can. But when you stop moving, you stop recording. So you can stand there, you can look at that bee, you can try and identify what it is, but you're not also recording all of the other bees flying back and forth, because you'll just get ridiculously high counts. And to try and standardise that a little bit, we have what we call this recording box. So essentially you're standing in the middle of the back of a box which is 4 meters wide, up to 4 meters in front of you, and between ground level and 2 meters high. That's just to standardise between bee species, between recorders, between habitat types, because you can see different distances, different habitats. Obviously in woodland you're going to struggle to see much beyond that sort of range, whereas in a nice open meadow you can see for miles in all directions. Different people can identify bees at different ranges, and different bees you can identify to species at different ranges. Something like a tree bumblebee is very, very distinctive. You've got a fair chance of seeing that even at range, whereas something like a garden bumblebee, there are other confusion species, you can only really identify it a little bit closer. So just to try and standardise what it is you're actually recording, do make sure that you only record bees within that box. It can be that they flew in, it can be that they sat on a flower and you walked towards them. Either of those is fine. If you know it's the same one, try and avoid recounting if you know that it flew around your head, for instance, but you don't need to worry too much beyond that about recounting. There's no reason it should change from year to year. Once you've seen a bee, identify it to species as far as possible. As I say, we've got unknown bumblebee, we've got unknown caste. If you don't know whether it's a male or a worker or a queen or whatever, or even if you don't know what species it is, that's still useful information. We can still use that in the analysis, just only go up to the limits of how far you're confident. If you're not sure what species it is, put it as unknown bumblebee. You can put a note in the comments saying that it was one of two or whatever, but don't say, yeah, that might as well go down as a red-tailed bumblebee, because that's not useful data. Try and record specific numbers. Again, we can put 21 into a statistic program. We can't put 20-ish. Do count honeybees. They're not bumblebees, but we are quite interested in how they coincide with bumblebees. If you're confident with some of the solitary bees, you can do those as well, but as I say, only if you're confident, only if they're not distracting you from the bumblebees. And you can catch the bumblebees and have a closer look at them. You can take photos of them and come back to them later. That's fine. 2 golden rules. Firstly, be consistent. Same route, roughly the same pace throughout, that kind of thing. And the other one, do please put data on the website. I know for a fact that we have people who do the fun bit, go out and walk the transect and have an ever-increasing heap of paper forms to put in at some point, and that point never comes. We can't do anything with that. That hasn't become data at this sort of stage. So please do send us the data. Once you've gone to the effort of setting up a transect and walking the transect and counting, identifying your bees, do that final last little step of actually putting the data into the website so that we can actually get the benefit of it. And we've got a whole load of resources online to help you with that. So if you go on the BeeWalk website, there's a resources page. You can see here, there's a whole load of useful bits and pieces on identification, extra bits and stuff around what we do with the data, the site forms, that kind of thing, guide on how to best identify bumblebees from photos, what photos to take, other YouTube guidance videos to take you through the different bits on the website and that kind of thing. If you get really stuck, we have Helen, our surveys officer, who's based up at Stirling. You can get hold of ideally via email, which is works 3 days a week. And we also have BeeWalk mentors, who again are long-serving BeeWalk volunteers who are happy to walk you through some of the aspects, or any of the aspects, whether that's identification or putting data into the website or whatever. So if you have any issues with any of that side of things, do get in touch with Helen on that email address, and we will help you through that as much as you possibly can. And in general, BeeWalk has really grown massively. So as you can see, we started in 2008 with very, very few either records or individual bumblebees. And since then, it's gone from strength to strength. We opened it to the membership of BBCT in 2010 after a couple of scoping years. We opened it to the general public in 2012. And it's just gone really, really well. It's done exactly what we wanted it to do. It's at the scale now where we've got all of these transects putting data in. It's at the level where we can really tell what's going on with Britain's bumblebees. You can see 587 transect sites in 2019, up to 150,000 records, almost 500,000 individual bumblebees. That's a massive heap of data, and it makes a massive improvement to what we can actually tell about what's going on with bees in Britain. And this is an example of what we can do with that data. This is the early bumblebee, one of our spring flying species. And this red line here is the average number of bees seen for each kilometre a transect walked in each year. So you can see in 2010, did okay, went downhill for a couple of years, really didn't like 2012, which isn't surprising because it rained all year. 2013 did a bit better. 2014, really, really good year. 2014 had a really nice, warm, early spring. So as a real spring specialist, it's not surprising that it did well. But then it reverted to the mean, dropped back for 2015, 16, 17. Really didn't like 2018, but then picked up a bit in 2019. So there's a lot of variation. This grey cloud is the standard deviation around this mean. So you can see there's a lot of change going on in here. But this is a species which is, broadly speaking, about flat if you take out the annual variation. If we look at the monthly abundance, this is again bees per kilometre walked, and you can see this red is the average from 2010 to 2018, blue is 2019, and so you can see that 2019 comes out as a really early year. So it's about the same in March, about the same in April as the average. Much higher abundance in May than you would expect, and then it declines more rapidly. So basically it's shifted a month or so earlier, peaking in May rather than June, and then we tail off. We see a few more at the end here, but basically this is a spring flying species. 2019 had a warm spring, and so it got through earlier than you might expect. We can do this for up to about 22 species at the moment. There's a couple of species that we don't have enough data to calculate these for, but it means that we can calculate the trend across all of these years. The 10-year trend on abundance data is getting to be quite useful. And we can also look at that within year variation. We can look at whether they're shifting the phenology and that kind of thing from this data. There's an awful lot of untapped stuff as well. And that concludes it for the first presentation of this morning. And we'll come back and we'll look at the actual species level identification of our big 8 common bumblebee species.